this. Okay. All right. Okay, this is a very brief timeline that I made. I'll show you later if you're interested. There's a very good resource that I use a lot online that can give you a much more extensive timeline. But this will suit us for our discussion today. So to start off, I want to explain why I chose to study the Tur and the Beit Yosef primarily. And since I wasn't sure of anybody's background, and even people who do have background sometimes aren't aware of this, so I'm going to give you a very quick history of halacha from the time of the Mishnah and up to the Tur, and I'll talk a little bit about after the Tur, but mainly I want to get up to the Tur and the Beit Yosef. So probably all familiar with some basics, that you have the Mishnah, which is the culmination of the oral Torah that's passed down and is redacted in the beginning of the 3rd century by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his Beit Din, and that ends the era of the Mishnah. In that, among his students, among Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's students, we have several people who round out that work. So the Mishnah, of course, is what we call Tanaitic literature. The rabbis in the Mishnah we call Tanaim, from the Aramaic words not, which is to repeat. Mishnah means repetition, and the idea is to repeat the Torah, as it says in the Torah, "V'shinantam levanecha," and you should repeat it to your children. So his students round out this period by other collections of Tanaitic literature, and we will be looking at them from time to time. So, and I didn't put them on this little thing here, but I'll mention them if you're not familiar. We have the Tosefta, which is Aramaic. It literally just means addenda, and it's Tanaitic literature. It's actually Mishnayot that didn't get into the final cut of the Mishnah. They were left out of the Mishnah, but they were collected. Not all of them were collected, but quite a few of them were collected. And these are written down in the same order as the Mishnah, tractate by tractate. Not always, Sabrina's here. Welcome, Sabrina. We're just talking and we'll pick it up as we go. Not always tractate by tractate, not always chapter by chapter. For those of you who just entered, I'm in the middle of or just began actually a bit of an introduction to explain the place of the Tur and Beit Yosef in halachic history. So you're still relatively at the beginning, and you may know some or all of this. So just that's what we have. Okay, so then you have the Mishnah. You have, collected by two of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's students, you have the collection of the Tosefta. In a standard printed Gemara, standard Vilna-based Shas, the Tosefta is in the very back. It's almost the very last thing that you'll find in the volume on any given tractate, set of tractates. There are also separate collections of Tosefta, but that's easy to find, and I'll show you later where you can access it online. You also have, from the same generation, you have collections of other Talmudic literature in the form of the Midrashei halacha. And the main Midrashei halacha are the Mechilta on the book of Shmot. We're going to look at the Mechilta today. You have the Sifra, also called the Torat Kohanim, on Sefer Vayikra. And then you have the Sifrei, which is the Midrash Halacha on Bamidbar and Dvarim. The the difference in style is very apparent. They're written in a midrashic style, so they're going verse by verse, and they're darshaning, right? They're showing you the method of drasha as you're going through them. Whereas Mishnah and Tosefta tend to bring you conclusions and certain logical arguments, and not that much of the underlying midrash that it's based on. So then also you have from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's students, you have the first generation of Amoraim. These are the people, of course, who compose the Gemara. Prominent among them in the first generation, you have Rabbi Yochanan, who was the Gadol Hador in Israel, and he's quoted frequently both in the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli. The Talmud Yerushalmi is the Talmud that was compiled in Israel during the 3rd century, and it's not as extensive as Talmud Bavli, which was compiled over a much longer period of time, although it does deal with certain masechtot that the Bavli doesn't, mainly in agricultural issues, in Seder Zrayim. The Talmud Bavli, of course, is the Babylonian Talmud. It is prominent among the students of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in the first generation who go back to Babel are Rav and Shmuel. And of course, there are many, many other students and generations that go after, and the discussions there tend to be more detailed, more comprehensive, and ultimately the Talmud Bavli was more accepted, more widely accepted as being the basis for deciding halacha. So I'm guessing that all of you have, to a greater or lesser extent, studied some Mishnah and some Gemara. And what you'll know from that study is that the Gemara, the Talmud, generally is not really a Sefer Halacha in the sense that it's not a code. It doesn't tend to give you decisions. It mostly is giving you the basis, the conceptual basis, the biblical basis, and the arguments for and against different halachot. It tends not to come to definite conclusions in many, many, many places. And so the job of writing codes started to come after the end of the era of the Talmud. The Talmud Bavli is finished off around the 5th toward the end of the 5th century. And I'm going to skip ahead to the 9th century. There are other codes that are written in between, but the most prominent code from this era, which is the era of the Gaonim, Gaon in modern Hebrew means a genius, but it was a title that was given to the heads of the yeshivot in Babel. They were the Gaonim. And the most prominent work to come out of this era is the Halachot Gedolot. And we don't know for sure who wrote it, so we tend to refer to the author by the name Baal Halachot Gedolot, master of the Halachot Gedolot, or the author of the Halachot Gedolot, also referred to by the acronym Bahag for short. It's a very pivotal work, and it served in the halachic world is more or less like the way we think of the Shulchan Aruch today. It was a comprehensive work. It deals with virtually all the halachot of the Talmud, and its writing style was to take the passages from the Talmud and just to bring the parts that the Bahag thought constituted the halacha. So he left out a lot of the discussion, and he would just bring the parts that he thought were conclusive. And that was the style of writing. I'm going to skip ahead another couple of centuries to the Rif, Rav Yitzhak Alfasi. Alfasi means that he was of Fez. He lived in Fez in Morocco. The Rif was extremely influential in halacha and still is to this day, although not as well studied as I think maybe he should be. And the Rif did a book that he also called Halachot, the Halachot of the Rif. In a standard Shas, it's printed in not at the very end, but it's the latter part of a volume in a standard Gemara. If you flip around, if you flip through the beginning of the standard volume, you'll see the Gemara. After that, you see a lot of other things that are in little Rashi script, and then you would get to the Rif, and the Rif is printed like a Gemara. His text is in the center in block letters, and it's surrounded by commentaries. The Rif's work was not comprehensive in the same way as the Bahag. He wrote halachot on all of the halachot that are in practice today, but he didn't write on the halachot that are not in practice today. So he didn't write about the korbanot. He didn't write about a lot of things having to do with taharot, etc. But nonetheless, his halachic work was very important. And in fact, when we talk about eras in these rabbis, right? So we have the Talmudic era. Immediately after the Talmudic era, you actually have the era of the Saboraim, which is also a title, and then the era of the Gaonim. And then we talk about the era of the Rishonim, right? The early ones, you could say the first ones or the early ones. So we call those people the Rishonim, and basically we start counting in the halachic, or we basically start counting from the Rif. The Rif was marked a new era because his work was seen as superseding the work of Gaonim. This is in fact what the Rambam held. The Rambam held the Rif in very, very high esteem, considered him to be the greatest of poskim. And in his own teaching, when he would teach shiurim, he taught the Rif. He didn't even teach his own work as much as he taught the Rif. So Rif is a very important posek. Of course, I mention here Rashi because, of course, Rashi is very important. Even though Rashi is a commentary, he did write halachic works, but those are not as prominent and they're not as important in halachic discourse. But of course, Rashi is absolutely pivotal in our understanding of the Talmud, and the way he explains the Talmud has a lot of halachic implication. And I just wanted to place him here so that you would know where he is time-wise. So he lives, in a very similar time as almost his life and the Rif's life basically overlap. It's not clear that one of them knew of the other. I don't think that there's any indication that they were aware of each other's works. When you look at a standard Rif, you'll see there's a commentary that says it's Rashi on the Rif, but it wasn't actually Rashi. It was simply because the Rif, again, wrote in the style of the Halachot Gedolot, meaning that he went Masechet by Masechet and Mishnah by Mishnah, and then what he did is he just edited out most of the Gemara that he didn't think would be relevant for the final psak. So his is a kind of a terse, like a concise version of the Talmud. Occasionally he will speak in his own voice, but the vast majority of the text of the Rif is taken directly from the Talmud. The reason I point this out also is because now we come to the Rambam. So the Rambam's major halachic work is the Mishnah Torah, which has caused a big stir when it was first published, and for a few hundred years after. It was revolutionary in many ways. One of the most basic ways it was revolutionary is that his was the first major code to not be written in the style of just taking quotes from the Gemara and putting them, laying them out in order. So the Rambam completely reorganizes halacha conceptually. He doesn't write in the same order as the Mishnah or the Gemara, and he chooses to write instead of the rabbinic Hebrew, which developed over this time, which is this mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic. He chooses to write in a pure Mishnaic Hebrew, which was also quite revolutionary, but his intention was to make this as widely accessible as possible. Just parenthetically, most of the other work that the Rambam wrote, he wrote in Judeo-Arabic, which at that time was widely accessible in the Middle East and even in parts of Europe. But of course now is, it's mostly just a literary language that you would have to go out of your way to learn. So the Rambam had a lot of foresight in writing his major work in Hebrew. So the Rambam, one of the big criticisms of the Mishnah Torah is that he doesn't cite his sources. And until now, there was no need for people to cite their sources because it was basically, they were showing you their sources. Everything they did was in a certain masechet, and they just took parts of that masechet and sort of cut and pasted them into their works. The Rambam rephrases everything because he has to make everything in Hebrew, and he reorders everything. So not everything is clear exactly where it comes from. And it became the task of the people who supported the Rambam almost immediately to write their commentaries around the Rambam, and mainly to cite his sources. Those are the what we call the nosei kelim, the squires, literally the people who carry the tools of their master. The commentaries that surround the Rambam on a standard page of the Mishnah Torah are mostly there to explain his sources, and then to some degree to start to explain him on a deeper level and reconcile seeming contradictions within the Rambam and so forth. Now I'm going to skip ahead. That brings us into the 14th century. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit later in the 13th into the 14th century, and we have the Rosh. We have Rabbeinu Asher. Rabbeinu Asher was also an important posek. He was a student of the Maharam Rutenberg, so he lived obviously in Germany and Rutenberg. He, along with several other students, became very important, very prominent rabbis in their time. You may know the Maharam Rutenberg at some point was taken. He was arrested and placed in jail by the authorities, the Christian authorities, and he was held for ransom. I don't think he was arrested on any particular charge, but they basically put him in jail so that they could extort money from the Jewish community. The Maharam Rutenberg forbade the Jewish community to pay the ransom. Because he was afraid that if they did that, then they would just keep doing it again and again with him or with other people. And he ended up, according to the tradition of the story, he ended up dying in jail. And he was there for, I should have looked this up again, but between 12 and 14 years he was in jail. He apparently told his major students that they should flee because they would be the next. So the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, he flees to Spain. So he's an interesting person in this regard also because he comes from Ashkenaz, from Germany, and he goes to Sfarad and he becomes a major halachic figure in Spain. The Rosh also wrote a Sefer Halachot. In a standard Gemara, you will see it right after the Gemara. There might be one or two pages of what are called Piskei Tosfot, which are the halachic conclusions of Tosfot, but then you'll see the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher. And the Rabbeinu Asher wrote his Sefer Halachot in the same style as the Rif, and what he contributed is the school of thought that was developed from Tosfot. Tosfot I didn't mention here, but right, Tosfot began in the generation after Rashi, beginning with his own first with his sons-in-law and then his grandsons. And Tosfot, we will do here and there. If you don't have experience with Tosfot, I would definitely talk more about it when we get there. The Rosh incorporates a lot of the halachic work of the Baalei Tosfot. He, in fact, as a separate work, he wrote his own version of the Tosfot. So his work was very, very important. And then we come to his son, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher. This is the author of the text that we're mainly going to be looking at. The Rosh actually had another just a second. Okay. I'm just getting used to using Zoom, so you'll have to pardon me. The Rosh had also another son, Rabbeinu Yechiel, who's also a prominent rabbi, but we mostly are going to be focusing on Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher, the Baal Turim. What the Baal Turim did in terms of his halachic work, also he decided to reorder the halacha. He made up his own order for the halacha, following in the footsteps of the Rosh and the Rif and many, many other poskim during this period. He focused really on the he focused on halachic works. He focused on the halachot that were practical for that era and did not focus on the halachot that were no longer practiced after the destruction of the temple. So the work he called the Arba'at Turim, it's of course it's a literary allusion to the 4 Turim, the 4 rows of precious stones that were on the breastplate of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, and he ordered all of halacha into 4 sections. The first section is called the Orach Chaim, the way of life, and essentially this is all time-bound and time-related mitzvot, beginning from the time somebody gets up in the morning till the time they go to bed, and all of the holidays and all of the things that have to do with those holidays. The second section he called Yored De'ah, teacher of knowledge, and essentially this is all of what I would call the ritual halachot that are not time-bound. So it includes things like kashrut, it will include laws of Sefer Torah and Mezuzah, plus a bunch of other things, Avelut, Nida, and so forth. At some point, if this shiur continues long enough, we'll get into Yoreh De'ah because we'll look at Hilchot Sefer Torah and Hilchot Mezuzah. The third section is the Even Ha'ezer, the rock of aid, of help. It's a reference to the idea of women, and it's all the halachot that have to do with relationships between men and women. So it discusses marriage and divorce and related halachot. And then the last section is Choshen HaMishpat, the breastplate of judgment, and that's what we would generally call now civil law. It's how to create a court, laws of testimony, laws of torts, damages, and stuff like that. So we are going to be focusing on, to begin with, the one chapter in the Orach Chaim, Siman Lamed Bet, which is the laws of how to write tefillin, which probably because of the order that he went in, they include most of the halachot that a sofer needs to know for writing tefillin, mezuzot, Sefer Torah, Megillah, etc. And also, of course, Siman Lamed Vav. I'm sure that many of you learned these, if not in the Tur, you probably learned the Shulchan Aruch or with the Mishnah Berurah, and we will touch on those later on. Now, the style of the Tur, we will see. The Tur created his own style, whereby for each set of halachot, he gives you a little bit of background He doesn't go into great depth. He was trying to keep it also concise. He wanted to write a concise code. But he does give you a little bit of the background from the scripture, from the Talmud, and he will sometimes quote various opinions that preceded him in this era of a few hundred years that preceded him. But almost inevitably, in virtually every case, his final halachic decision is the same as his father, the Rosh. So we skip ahead now from the 14th century into the 16th century. We come to Yosef Karo. Yosef Karo was born in Spain, 1488. We all know what happened in 1492. He was forced out of, he and his family was forced out of Spain. I believe he went then to, I think the family did some travels. I think he spent some time in Turkey studying, and he ended up in Sfat in Israel. The Yosef Karo, in terms of his halachic work, he wanted to write a comprehensive summary of this era that we now call the Rishonim, because he saw that by then there were many halachic works. I've skipped over dozens, right? There were many, many halachic works, big and small, and he understood that, he felt things were getting out of hand, that instead of having, 2 Torot in the world, they're going to have dozens of Torot in the world because there's so many different halachic opinions. And what he sought to do was to make a kind of compendium of these decisions and then come to one single halachic conclusion. And unlike the Rambam, he was going to be completely transparent about his sources. So he was going to do this, and then he realized that the Tur had already laid the groundwork. And because, as I said, the Tur does some of this work already, he decides to write this work around the Tur. So some of what the Beit Yosef is doing is commenting directly on the Tur, but mostly what he's going to do is supply a lot of the underlying discussion that the Tur leaves out, going back to Talmudic sources, but also sources in the Rishonim that the Tur doesn't mention. And of course, the question is, how does the Beit Yosef make his decision about psak? So he comes up with his own methodology. And now you'll understand why I chose particular people to be in this list. He says that when we look now, he says really the greatest of the halachic authorities from these preceding generations are the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh, that those codes are the most widely accepted. So he puts them in a category unto themselves, and he says, I'm going to decide halacha based on the majority of those opinions. 2 out of 3 will decide halacha for anything that they discussed. However, he's aware that that's not always decisive for various reasons. Sometimes maybe somebody didn't discuss a halacha, sometimes it's not necessarily 100% clear. So he goes to another tier. There's a second tier of poskim. I didn't mention here, but a lot of these are the people who came in either were Baalei Tosfot themselves, they were people who wrote Tosfot, or they were in the schools related to the Tosfot, and they wrote Chidushim, right? They wrote the novellae on the Talmud, and prominent among them would be the Ramban, the Ran, the Tur and Beit Yosef, Rabbeinu Yehonatan, many other people, and he considered those to be the next tier. And then there's a third tier, and these were generally smaller halachic works that were not as comprehensive. One of them you may be familiar with, in the Beit Yosef in Siman Lamed Vav, when he describes the letters, he is drawing to begin with on a book that was called the Baruch She'amar. And we'll talk about that. So this is one of these books that came from the area of the Rishonim. It was a specialty book. It dealt with the halachot of Stam. And when we get there, we'll talk more about it. It was really two books that he was quoting. A book called the Tikkun Tefillin. The book Shamar was a commentary that was written around the Tikkun Tefillin. But nonetheless, it's an example where he adds in something that most of Siman Lamed Vav in the Beit Yosef are things that the Tur didn't even put in. He didn't put in, except for just a few things about Surat Ot. The Beit Yosef fills that out in a big way based on this work. And he quotes this is also a level where he might be quoting Tshuvot, right, different responsa, etc. So this work is a huge work. It's a phenomenal work, and we'll get to be learning that. And after he writes it, he writes the conclusion of the work in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is essentially the halacha conclusions of the Beit Yosef, of what he wrote in the Beit Yosef. And he decides to write in the same order as the Tur. So this whatever chapter you learn in the Tur, you'll see it's the same chapter in the Shulchan Aruch. Around this contemporary, I should have put on the list, but I'll just tell you, is the Ramah. It's contemporary of Rav Yosef Karo is the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, who is, in his time, probably the most prominent rabbi in Ashkenaz. He actually lived in Poland, and he was also, at this time, planning to write a similar work to what the Beit Yosef had wanted to write, this kind of comprehensive work. But then he also sees that not only is the Tur written, but the Beit Yosef is written. And so what he does is he writes glosses directly onto the Tur, and then he writes his glosses directly onto the Shulchan Aruch. And the main thing that he wanted to contribute, that he felt was deficient in the Beit Yosef and in the Shulchan Aruch, is that it leaned more heavily on Sephardic tradition, right? If we think about even the main poskim that the Beit Yosef uses, Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh, 2 out of 3 were originally from Spain, and the Rosh himself also from Spain, although we mostly stick to the Ashkenazi school of thought. So we'll be looking occasionally at the Ramah. Ramah's glosses on the Torah called the Darkei Moshe. And we'll see that. Of course, after the Shulchan Aruch then set the stage for halacha until this day. And since that time, not all, but most halachic works were either written as commentaries around the Shulchan Aruch, some of which you're probably familiar with, like the Magen Avraham and the Taz, the Turei Zahav. And then much more recently, you have the Mishnah Brura, which was written by the Chafetz Chaim, but only on the first Tur, only on Orach Chaim. We have along the way the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe, which was written on Orach Chaim, and then some sections of Yoredea and Choshen and Mishpat. But also an important work, and it's also an important work in Sofrut. We'll get to that eventually. I'm guessing that, not guessing, some of you told me, some of you have learned Keset HaSofer. So Keset HaSofer was written in the 19th century by Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, who's most famous for writing the Shulchan Aruch, but he also wrote a number of specialty halachic works. One of them is the Keset HaSofer. He also wrote a similar kind of work on Hilchot Shkita, on Hilchot Rutin, on Hilchot Taharat Mishpacha. And these are all important works in their own right in each of the areas that he wrote in. The Keset HaSofer is still, of course, a very prominent work for Sofrim. One of the main reasons that came about is because he had the haskama, he had the approbation of the Chatam Sofer. The Chatam Sofer wrote a haskama to his work, and you can look at it if you have a copy of the Keset HaSofer. It's printed right there, and he says that now that this work has been published, anybody who wants to be a sofer has to know this work by heart. So you don't get many approbations on that level, and it's stuck. It's very, very important to have the work. But again, just to summarize here, so I've chosen to teach right now the Tur and the Beit Yosef, and we'll be looking at some of the other commentaries that were written around the Tur, but it's mainly to supply you with the underpinnings, the halachic underpinnings. It's a very good sort of work. It will bring us back to the Talmudic sources and Rishonim, and it will serve as a basis for understanding the later sources. So that's that. Are there any questions before I go on? Now we're going to get more into the learning.
Where does the Pri Megadim fit into this?
Pri Megadim was a commentary. It's a commentary on a commentary. I think the word is a super commentary. He was a commentary who wrote commentaries on the two main commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. So you have the Shulchan Aruch, and on the Orach Chaim you have on the part of the page that's close to the binding you have the Taz, and on the outer part of the page you have the Magen Avraham. And the Pri Megadim wrote a commentary on each of them.
Oh.
And on the commentary that he wrote on the Taz, he called the Mishbetzet Zahav, right? The Taz is the Turei Zahav, the rows of gold, and he wrote the Mishbetzet Zahav, which would mean like the frames that hold the gold. And on the Magen Avraham, he wrote what he called the Eshel Avraham. And yes, that's where they fit in. And yeah, it's interesting because of course the Pri Megadim also do write extensively on Hilchot Stam. In fact, the Mishnah Berurah quotes directly from him. I believe it's in the beginning of the Ad Sofrim in Siman Lamed Vav, where he just takes a whole section of the introduction Pri Megadim wrote and copies it into the Mishnah Berurah. It's a very important posek. Any other questions? Okay. I left out a lot of people. I'm also a very big fan of the Aruch HaShulchan. It was a contemporary of the Mishnah Berurah, written by Rav Yechiel Michael Epstein, who also wrote comprehensively in a very different style than the Mishnah Berurah. And along the way, we will be looking at these various sources, but not right away. We will be looking at, we're going to try to stick in the beginning of these discussions to the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so what I want to show you now, I assume that everybody got the prepared sheets that I sent. I'm going to put them on the screen in a moment, but before I do, I just want to introduce you. I know not a lot of people are not familiar with this website. I know Sefaria is a very popular website, and I like Sefaria a lot, but for many practical reasons, I mostly do my online learning using this website called Al HaTorah. I believe I sent people a link to it, and I just want to point out a couple of things about how it's used. So, and I encourage you to explore. I'll just mention, because I have this little timeline. If you're on their homepage and you skip down a little bit. By the way, you can do the pages in English or in Hebrew. You can get they have their own timeline. Sirzvan Shel Parshanim, Mapata Parshanim, which is a really clever thing that shows you a map and has little places on the map. Anywhere you click, it will show you the name of the rabbis that lived there and when they lived. It gives you another aspect of understanding how a lot of halachic literature is related. Geography also plays a part. To get to Tur, just as an example. Second. So if you're on here, if you're on the beginning, you can go right into halacha, and there's a more extensive library here. It's a Sofrut. But if you want to go just to the main works, you can go to the Arba Turim, click on that. It brings you to this page, and here you can click where you want to look in the Tur, and we're going to be on Siman Lamed. And it comes, you have three options. You can either look just at the words of the Tur, just at his text. You can put the Tur side by side with the Shulchan Aruch, right? So you can see line by line how they parallel each other. Or you can click here, you can choose which commentators you would like to see. You can choose them one by one. So let's say the Beit Yosef. And if you want, you can imitate sort of the way it would be in a printed edition. You have one halacha, and then beneath it you would have the commentaries on that particular halacha. For the purposes of this class, most of what we'll be learning in the Tur and the Beit Yosef are sheets that I've prepared for you to make it easier for you to follow, because if you're not familiar with the language. Okay, so with that, in the last 15 minutes, we're going to start. We'll get into it. Let's see. Make sure that I'm sharing the right screen. It's this. Okay. All right, so here we are. Tur Orach Chaim, Siman Lamed Bet, with the Beit Yosef. Mitzvat Tefillin, Shichtov Arba Parshiyot, Shehem. Right, so the mitzvah of Tefillin is to write 4 sections from the Torah, and these are them. Kadesh Likol Bechor, Ad L'Moada Miyamim Yemima, Vayaki Yaviyacha, Ad Ki B'chos Yad Hotziano Hashem Mimitzrayim, V'Parshat Shema Ad Ubisharecha, V'Parshat Vayim Shema Ad Al Haaretz, Kol Achat V'Achat B'Klaf Levada. Right, so it's those 4 parshiyot, each one on its own separate piece of parchment. So that's all he says about that. Now we know that that's not entirely true, because that's going to be true for the Shel Rosh, not for the Shel Yad, and we'll talk about that along the way. The Beit Yosef remarks here, so the Beit Yosef here is just going to supply us with sources. The mitzvah of Tefillin is to write Arba Parshiyot, Shehem Kadesh Li V'Chulei. Hashut, this is obvious in the Mechilta. The Mechilta down there. 1 second, let me close that before it makes any more noise. I quoted the Mechilta down there. We'll look at it briefly. Perek HaKometz. Perek HaKometz, if you don't know, is the 3rd chapter of Masechet Menachot. And there in Masechet Menachot, maybe some of you learned this or learned part of it, is the longest and most important sugya in the Gemara that deals with Hilchot Stam. It's not the only one, but it's the longest and the most comprehensive. And it's called, the names of chapters in the Gemara are named after usually the first word or words of that chapter, and the beginning of that chapter starts with the word Hakometz. In Tam Lamed Dalet Amud Bet, we're going to take a look at it briefly just to show it to you, but I'm going to show you for the moment the Mechilta down here in footnote 1. Oops. This is the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, Parshat Bo, Masechta de Pischa, Parshat Yud Chet. Right. This is, if you look in the Mechilta, this is the very end of Parshat Bo in the Mechilta. And this is the language of the Mechilta. It says, Vayala Ot V'Gomer. So this is from the Parsha V'Hayaki V'Yacha. And it's, right, it quotes that pasuk, it will be to you as a sign upon your hand, Vayala Ot Al Yadcha, with Dalet Kafeh there. V'Arba Mekomot Maskir Parshat Tefillin. So the Mechilta says, there are 4 places that the Torah mentions the Parsha of Tefillin. Kadesh Li, Ve'akev Yacha, Shema V'ayim Shema. These 4 Parshiyot. Mikan Amru. So from here they said, from here the rabbis said, Mitzvat Tefillin Arba Parshiyot. In other words, the rabbis understood through their understanding of the tradition that in those 4 places where the Torah speaks about tefillin, those parshiyot themselves are the tefillin. In a similar way that they come to that conclusion with mezuzah. The 2 places where the Torah says that you have to write a mezuzah onto the doorposts of your house, and those parshiyot are what we call the mezuzah. Those are the parshiyot that you have to put on the doorposts of your house. Shel Yad and Kerech Echad. So the Shel Yad is one roll, right? So that's the part that the Tur didn't mention. And then Arba Parshiot Shel Rosh Hem Arba Totafot. The 4 Parshiot of the Rosh are 4 Totafot. The Elu Hein Kadesh Li V'Hayakev Yacha Shema V'Hayim Shema. This term Totafot is something that the Gemara in Masechet Menachot talks more about. I'm not going to talk about it here. And here it adds in this very important halacha that Sofrim all know, Kodvan Kesidran. You write them in order. V'im lo Kodvan Kesidran, hare elu yiganezu. If you don't write them in order, then you must hide them away. Right? The idea of putting something into Geniza means you can't throw it away, right? Because it's holy. It has God's name written on it, but you can't use it. So Geniza was a way of taking things out of public circulation. And that concept will come up again in our studies later on. So that's the Mechilta. I'm going to show you very briefly, since I don't have as much time as I originally planned. The Gemara that he's quoting from Masechet Menachot, first of all, is based on a Gemara it's based on a Mishnah that's brought down in Menachot, Daf Kafchet, Amud Aleph. Let me show you that. And it talks about various mitzvot. Menachot, of course, deals mainly with the meal offerings that were brought in the Beit HaMikdash, and then a lot of other attendant mitzvot that were done in the Beit HaMikdash, including things that have to do with the menorah, lighting the menorah, and so forth. And so here it says, Shiva kanei menorah ma'akvin ze et ze. The 7 branches of the menorah hold each other back. In other words, there isn't a mitzvah. Let's say you have, the menorah, the Beit HaMikdash, is damaged. It only has 6 branches or 5 branches. So there's no mitzvah of lighting it with less than 7 branches. Each branch holds back the other one until you have all of them together. You have not completed the mitzvah. Shiva neroteha makvin zeh. It's 4, right? So the mitzvah of having the menorah, of building the menorah, you have to have all 7 branches. And then the lamps, each of the candles that you light, also hold each other back. You have to light all 7. There are times when you're cleaning it that you have some lit and some not lit, but that's a separate issue. Shtei parshiyot shebemizuzah ma'akvot zu et zu. The 2 passages that are in a mezuzah hold each other back, right? So you can't write just Shema or just V'hayim Shemo. You have to write both of them. Anything less than that, you don't have a mezuzah. You have not fulfilled the mitzvah. Afilu katav echad makvan. Even one writing holds them back. And we'll discuss that later on. Dalet parshiot shebitfilin. The 4 passages of tefillin hold each other back. Afilu katav echad makvan. Even one writing holds them back. And just to finish off this Mishnah, the 4 tzitziot makvot zuetzu. The 4 tzitziot that you have on a garment hold each other back. So if you're missing one, you're not yotzei the mitzvah. Sharba'atan mitzvah achad. All 4 of them together are one mitzvah. Rabbi Yishmael disagrees, and he says arba'atan arba mitzvot. In that one halacha he disagrees. He said actually each of them is a mitzvah unto itself. I'm going to flip ahead right now just to show you the sugya that the Beit Yosef is referring to. And it begins here at the end of Lamed Gimel Amud Bet. The Gemara here quotes the Mishnah that we just looked at. Arba Parshiot Shabbat Tefillin Makvot Zu Et Zu, Afilu Ktav Echad Makvan. It starts to discuss that Gemara, and it continues here. And then it is part of that discussion, it brings us this Braita, right? So when I mentioned before, after the Mishnah, we have collections of other Tannaitic literature. All Tannaitic literature that was not included in the Mishnah falls under this category of Braita, right? Coming from the word in Aramaic, that means outside. It's outside Tannaitic literature. The Gemara quotes now a Braita. It says, Yachol yichtavem al arba orot. It could be that you would write them, you would write the 4 passages of the tefillin on 4 separate pieces of skin. V'yamichem ba'arba batim ba'arba orot. And you would put them into 4 chambers that were also each made up of 4 separate pieces of skin. Talmud Lomar, the Torah teaches us, Uluzikaron beinenecha. It will be as a remembrance between your eyes. So that passage is here. You can write. They give you the hyperlink. You can click on it right away. Right. So this is in Parshat Kadesh. Right. It's the first passage that talks about tefillin. Toward the end of the passage, where it's talking about the tefillin, it says, "V'hayadacha la'ot al yadcha." It'll be as a sign on your hand. Ulezikaron beinenecha, as a remembrance between your eyes. So what do we learn from that? In other words, so zikaron in this context contrasts with what word that we're familiar with? What's the word that the Torah uses elsewhere when it's talking?
Totafot.
Totafot, right? So the exception. In the other parts of the Torah, it always says u'totafot beinenecha. So what do we learn out from zikaron? Right? So it says Talmud Lomar u'zikaron beinenecha, zikaron echad amarti lach. I said one remembrance. So zikaron is a singular word. Totafot is plural. So zikaron comes to tell us that there's something singular about the shel rosh, right? Zikaron echad amarti lach, v'lo shtayim shlosha zichronot, shtayim shalosh zichronot, not 2 or 3 zichronot. Ha-ketzad, so how does that work? Kotvan al daled orot, so you write them on 4 separate pieces of skin. Menichan ba'arba batim, you do put them into 4 separate chambers, be'or echad, but the 4 separate chambers are made up of 1 single piece of skin. So this is the basis, this is the midrashic basis for the idea of how we make the shel rosh. And to bring it back to the Beit Yosef, that's the Gemara that he's referring to. That's from Perek HaKometz. Because it's getting late, I want you to know I usually encourage people to answer questions that I'm putting out there along the way, but because I'm running a little late, I'm going to do most of the talking till the end. So you'll have to pardon me. Let's look at the next part. What I did here, I took the last line from this first part and I put it into a separate block because it's really a separate halacha. Each of those parshiot are written on a separate piece of cloth. So the Beit Yosef here comments, Masha Katav, Mem Shin is Masha Katav, that which he wrote. Kol achat v'achat b'klaf davad, each one on its separate piece of parchment. Hayinu b'tfilin shel rosh, right? He's talking about the tefillin shel rosh. Aval b'shel yad, kotvin kulan b'klaf echad. You write them all on a single piece of parchment. K'de'ita Kideit means as it is, kamo sheyesh, in Hebrew, Biperek HaTometz, Sham, right? Sham is there, Ibid, the same place that we looked a moment ago. V'chein katav Rabbeinu l'kaman. And Rabbeinu, whenever the Beit Yosef uses the term Rabbeinu, he's referring to the Tur, right? He's our master, the master that he is commenting on. And you'll see this when you learn other Rishonim who wrote commentaries on other people, like the commentaries surrounding the Rambam, or the commentaries surrounding the Rif, refer to the Rambam and the Rif respectively as Rabbeinu, right? Whoever the main book is always Rabbeinu. So this is also true. And so he says that the Tur, Rabbeinu, he's going to talk about this distinction between Shorosh and Shalyad later on. That's much right toward the end of the Siman, so we won't get there for a while. What I did here is I took the next section and I copied and pasted it into this here. And what I'm going to do today, I'm just going to read this part here about the first halacha, and each one of these is going to be in a separate block, but I wanted to put them all together just so it wouldn't be too, so it would have like some kind of grammatic cohesiveness at this point. So he's still, right, the Tur is still talking, right? He's saying this is the mitzvah of tefillin. It's these 4 parshiot, each one on a separate piece of parchment. And then he's telling us more detail. Yichtavein b'chtav miyushar. You should write it with a straight script. We'll see different interpretations of that in a moment. Uvidyo, you have to write it with ink. B'chtivat tama, right? And you're often with the concept of chtivat tama, but we'll look at that in depth. Shehekol ot v'ot mukaf gvil. Each letter should be surrounded by the skin. U'metuyad karaui, and given its crowns properly. V'lo yechsar afil kotso shel yud. It should not be missing even the thorn or the serif of the yud. But tzarich shichtov b'yimino. He has to write with his right hand. If he controls both of his hands, in other words, if he's ambidextrous, if he is left-handed, small didei hu yamin. His left is right. His left is his right hand for this. His left is his yamin for this halachic purpose. So left-handed person is left-handed person writes with his left hand, a right-handed person writes with his right hand, an ambidextrous person writes with their right hand. So all of these things we're going to go into a lot of detail about in the future. So just to look at this part here, v'yichtevein b'chtav miyushar. You should write them with a straight ktav. Nira dahain mishum dichtiv. Right? It seems that it's because it's written, this is my God and I shall beautify him. Right? Which is a line from where?
It's the Shirat Hayam, isn't it?
Yes, it's a line from Shirat Hayam, which it's worth looking into in greater depth, but I'm not going to do that now. But it's a fascinating verse, and we're just going to look at one view of it, which is pertinent to our discussion. Make it or make yourself beautiful before him with the mitzvot. So that's a Gemara Masechet Shabbat, which I do want to look at just briefly. And of course, you're all welcome to look at these things yourselves, but by the way, I want to tell you one of the other features of Al HaTorah for the Gemara, if you click here, I think I've just shared the screen again. Sorry. Is that the right one? What? Hold on a second. Yeah. Just so you know, right? So here it has the text. Sometimes it doesn't have it for all of the Gemara. If there's an aleph here that has a kamatz underneath it, whenever it's possible to have the nikud, you can click that on and off. Here they don't have the nikud for this text, so it's just grayed out. But on this side you have an ayin for Ivrit and E for English. When you click this, you have the Ivrit of Steinsaltz. This is Steinsaltz on the Gemara. And if you click it again, you have the English translation of Steinsaltz. So it's a very helpful tool that you can access easily. So this is a discussion. This is in the midst of a discussion about Brit Milah, but we're just going to take a look a little bit at this Braita. In this context, it's talking about when you do a Brit Milah on Shabbat, right? So there are certain restrictions, and if you cut off enough that it's a kosher Brit Milah, but maybe it wasn't a clean cut, and normally you would go back and maybe cut off a little bit more so that it looks nicer. There's a question about whether or not you can do that on Shabbat. So that's not our discussion, but in the context of that, this question of beautifying mitzvot comes up. This is also a Braita. Titania, Zeh Keli v'anvehu. This is my God, and I shall beautify him. Hina'el lefanav mitzvot. Right? Make yourself beautiful before him with mitzvot. For example, Aseh lefanav sukkah na'ah. Make before him a beautiful sukkah. Lulav na'eh. Get a beautiful lulav, meaning beautiful adam. The shofar na'eh. You should have a beautiful shofar when you blow shofar. Tzitzit na'eh. You should have a beautiful garment with beautiful tzitzit. Sefer Torah na'eh. You should have a beautiful Sefer Torah. Uchtov bo lishmo. You should write in it for its sake. Bidyo na'eh. With beautiful ink. Bekulmus na'eh. With a beautiful writing instrument. Bilavlar uman. With an expert sofer. The korchan b'shiraim na'im. You should wrap it with beautiful cloths, beautiful silks. There's an alternate understanding of this verse here from Abba Shaul. Abba Shaul Omer, ve'anvehu means something else. It means habidom elo. You should be like him, and it's make yourself like God. Mahu chanun rachum, just as he is merciful. You should also imitate God in terms of his attributes. But for our purposes, like we see, it mentions Sefer Torah na'eh, Diyo na'eh, Kumus na'eh. I wrote in my little short biography about myself, I was privileged to learn with an important rabbi in Boston at the time, Rav Mordechai Savitsky, and I actually learned this Gemara with him once, and he got stuck on this. He said, I understand all these other things that you should make beautiful, but what difference does it make if your kulmus is beautiful? Because you don't see the kulmus afterwards. You only see the Sefer Torah, you only see the Diyo. So I explained to him that actually, from a technical point of view, you don't end up with a beautiful Sefer Torah. You don't end up with a beautiful script unless you have a beautiful kulmus. If your kulmus is not done correctly, then none of the rest of it comes out well. And this is something that clearly this Braita, to my mind, had in mind when it mentioned that. Let's go back just to finish off this little part of the tour, and then I'll take any questions, and that'll do it for today. So the Beit Yosef says, right? He said that when this is just like 3 words in the tour, so he wants to understand them a little bit better. So he says it seems that the Nira Dahainu, in other words, it seems that this is, in other words, that the tour is saying this based on this Gemara here. That you should make things beautiful. Mitam zeh katav b'Mordechai. Mordechai was also a contemporary of the Rosh, one of the students of the Maharam Rutenberg. He wrote very important glosses that are printed after the Rif in the standard Gemara. The Mordechai wrote in Hilchot Tfilin, Shichtov K'tiva Gasa, based on this idea of writing a beautiful script, and he said you should write a thick script, Shelo Yehen Nimchak Maher, so it won't be erased quickly. Right, and we know in Ashkenazi scripts that's been the minhag since at least the Middle Ages to write a thicker script, a heavier script. Uchtav miyushar, the Beit Yosef says, Nirash Ratzalomar katav mitlushar. Seems like what he means by katav miyushar is like again miyushar. Miyushar literally means like happy, right? Somebody who's miyushar. But it also means, it denotes strength and beauty. Chomar yafeh means you should write a beautiful script. Vefshar, and it could be, dahainu lomar shichtov hashitot yisharot v'lo akumot. It means that you should be writing your lines straight and not bent, right? Not misshapen. V'chein mashma midivrei harash b'seder tikun tefillin. And that seems to be what's implied by the Rosh in the Seder Tikkun Tefillin, which is where the Rosh wrote these halachot. I brought that quote in the Rosh here in line 3, and you can see if you read this, it's very clear. It's actually clear that that's what the Rosh means by Katav Miyushar. It means to write straight. So that's a good place to stop. Next time, we're going to be looking at this Uvidyo. I'm going to send you some sheets that give you a little bit of an introduction to Dio based on things that are mentioned in the Mishnah. And then we'll see, this is going to take a while. This discussion of Dio and the Beit Yosef starts here and extends all the way down to here. And that's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff for us to look at. So as I finish now, are there any questions for those of you who managed to stay to the end?
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Well, you're very welcome.